If you are into movie-related discussions, you've come to the right place. Who am I to ask? I am the Wiz, and I'm here today with...
Zero.
How are you doing today?
A little bit more well-rested, especially since this week was a little bit more on the quiet end for my industry, so it was a more contemplative week, but a little bit better than having to be thrown into two deadlines and having to do them pretty much back-to-back.
Well,
but... yeah.
That's good. It is good that even the pornography industry can have a lot of quiet time. So that's good. That's good to hear. All right, well, come on now. So we are here today to review the 1989 documentary For All Mankind, directed by Al Reinert. Zero, I don't know if you've heard of this movie before. I've heard of this movie tangentially. So when I decided on this one, again, decided I wanted to watch this because it's on the Criterion Collection. It's something that is constantly being shoved to people to buy it, or it's on the Criterion channel and everything. But have you heard of this movie before?
Yeah, I had one of my friends who was a really big space and meteorology nerd, and this was one of the ones he was just like, oh my god, if you haven't seen For All Mankind, then you need to make time out of your day. You need to just turn off your phone and just watch this. It is such a great documentary, and it was always one of those, for me, I was just like, yeah, that's nice, I'll get around to it.
So your friend's a fucking nerd, is that what you're telling me?
Oh yeah, he's a big Carl Sagan fan and all that sort of stuff, so really into the whole space thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Again, I've heard about this film, but mostly it's because when the Criterion Collection does some articles on documentaries, or whenever they release new documentaries, this is the one that gets mentioned a lot about what a great documentary this is. So I've been curious about it, and I didn't know much about it. I know it had something to do with the moon landing. I just haven't gotten around to seeing it, so I'm glad we watched it now. So why don't we get into the review of For All Mankind, the documentary directed by Al Reinert. I'm actually surprised I've never seen this movie at all, because this just seems like a movie that if you are in a science class, either in middle school or elementary school or high school, I would think that you would want your students to see this movie, just to get a feel for what it was like for these men to be doing the moon landing. This
film was actually really interesting, but yeah, much like you, the first thought in my head was, oh man, this is total science class fodder. If the teacher's like, man, I got the worst fucking migraine, fuck this, I don't want to deal with my kids, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna turn on For All Mankind and let that shit go.
Yeah, like that, to me, this would have been the perfect film to do that. And not only to do that, but to also go over some of the things that, like the specific things that happened in the moon landing and everything. I would say in high school, this would probably be a great documentary to go over in a science class. If you're doing that specific type of science homework, or what would it be like with physics, or like, I was terrible in science, so I'm not really the best person for this. I watched it, and it was fascinating to watch, just to see. I was thinking this was going to be like a talking head documentary, where they would show some archival footage, but they would talk to like Buzz Aldrin or to Neil Armstrong about how they were feeling. But what they did in this movie is that they basically, what it sounded like is they used the audio from the moment that they were preparing to get launched to the point where they landed, and they used all the audio and video from there. Am I right on that, at least?
Yeah, it was kind of a sort of behind the scenes of what all logistics that they had to do to prepare to get these astronauts to the moon, and then all the stuff that happened in between. You had some kind of fun random moments and everything interspersed in the entire documentary, but I think my favorite moment was just when you have one of the astronauts just outside, just floating around in space and just goofing off, and then you hear like a message from one of the folks on ground control saying the flight director is saying to get back inside. I was just like, oh man, holy shit, these astronauts are fucking cowboys just out in the blackness of space.
Yeah, like, it was actually kind of funny and really neat, actually, to see these guys just goofing off and doing really silly things in space like that. But when I was watching it, I wasn't thinking of, oh god, these guys could die at any moment if they do anything stupid. At the time, I was thinking, well, yeah, if I was in this case, I would goof the fuck off too. This is great. Why wouldn't I do this? Like, what other time am I going to be able to do this? Like, it's actually really interesting to see, like, these men do something like this. But let me ask you something. Something I was thinking about at the end of the movie. Did you wish it was kind of a Talking Heads kind of movie? Or did you appreciate the fact that it was very of that moment?
I kind of like this sort of in-the-moment style recording and everything, mostly because it feels so much more human and so much more genuine. The usual talking head sort of shows that they do for documentaries, I always hate those because it just feels way too constricted. Like, you don't really get a feel for just how the subject's being interviewed as a person. It's just kind of all right, dress up in a nice suit, we're going to ask the questions, and you need to stick with answers that, our PR firm has approved for you to answer. Got it? And then it's like, okay. And then it's just kind of like a real buttoned up affair. But yeah, I kind of like these sort of documentaries mostly because it just feels in the moment and at the same time also off the cuff.
That is a good point, because I was going to say I actually would prefer the talking head ones because you can get a very good interviewer who can ask the right questions and get a different story or a different perspective out of it that you couldn't get in this. But your point is well taken, because I think in this one, you would not only have handlers for NASA, you'd have handlers for the government as well, making sure that no one, and I mean no one, goes off to a certain tangent that they don't want anyone to know about. So I guess maybe in this case, you're right. This probably would be the best thing they could do in this one. But for like other things, like if Errol Morris would have done this, the person who did The Thin Blue Line and Scandal, or it's a Tabloid, I'm sorry, that can do really good interviews in their documentaries, then I would be like, no, I would rather it be that kind of documentary. But I think in this specific movie, you're probably right. This is probably the best thing they could have done on this one.
So what makes the whole production of For All Mankind so interesting, when I was doing some supplemental research, was that at one point, to get the original footage and everything, Reinert had to take an optical printer with him to the Johnson Space Center, where the original film was being held, and ended up having to scan each frame from the original 16mm film and then blow it up to 35 millimeters. And this process took a whopping 18 months to copy 80 minutes of film to be used in the documentary. Most people would just kind of look at that and go, wow, holy cow, you're scrolling through millions and millions of feet worth of original film footage just to blow it up, and you're only going to use 80 minutes of it? Why? Why would you do that? That's just way too much work for too little gain. And I think the end results of how human this film feels as a documentary is really just the proof that the effort was really worth the time that it took, even as tedious as it was.
I would also imagine that the thing that they would have to do in that, just to develop that footage from whatever video encoding it had at the time to what it was in the 80s then, probably took a lot of extra manpower and a lot of time to actually do this. So you had to be incredibly selective with what you had to do and what you had to use in order to get that done. So not only, I wouldn't look at that as, oh, all that footage and you only could use 80 minutes, that seems like such a waste. I look at that as, no, you have to find the right stuff to use, or else it would have taken much longer to get that done. Like, he would have had this done probably in like 94, 95 if he made it a much longer film. But even if this movie was 2 hours long, I don't think it would have helped, because I think what he did in this movie, and like you said, the way that he portrayed these astronauts, I think was the right call on this. It made it feel like a much more intimate portrayal, whereas, and I think you've said this before in the review as well, whereas it would have been a much more clinical kind of documentary if they put more into it. Because let's also be honest here, a lot of the audio you're hearing is a lot of jargon that if you are not keenly aware of what they're talking about, it's going to fly over a lot of people's heads. So if you're going to have like 2 hours worth of footage, it might be more of the jargony stuff, which I would say would probably not be a great idea. But yeah, that's definitely interesting to note. That's fascinating on that end. Did they talk about what kind of audio, or not audio, but video codecs they had to use?
Well, this was like literal analog film, so there were no codecs.
Wow. Okay.
So they used 16 millimeter cameras when the astronauts took their cameras with them to space. So yeah, he was literally having to take this optical printer, scan the original 16 millimeter film, and then blow it up to 35 millimeters.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. And I know I've read a few places too that people complain that because a lot of people that are into Criterion, they bought the 4K and the Blu-ray versions of this movie, but they did not like the fact that the black bars on the left and the right were still there. And to me, that's like, what else could they have done on this? Like, did you really want that image blown up or cut just so it can fit a 16:9 frame? I think that would have been utterly ridiculous. And I think the way that it looks adds I hate to say I charmed it, because I think it belittles the actual content that's being said, but I think it really hones in on what it was like there. While I would have liked to have seen a beautiful 16:9 image of the moon landing at that time, I think that would have been technically impossible, or it would really distorted the image. Even though we do have the technology to possibly do that, I think the way that they kept the film the way it is the right move on this.
Yeah, I feel the same as well, too.
Yeah.
Sure, it's a little sad to see the black bars, but, I mean, the film standard back then was a 4:3. There's not much you can do. It's a literal physical limitation.
All right, so let's get into final thoughts on For All Mankind. I will go first. I think this is a very well done, very good documentary. It's not one of my favorites, but this is also a subject that I am not entirely, I guess, knowledgeable about, so I will state that as well. But I think they did the right move here after talking to you about this, where I thought it could have been better as a Talking Heads documentary, but you proved the point that the way that they portrayed these men in this situation, I think, was the better move on this one. So I will give you credit on that, Zero. I'm going to give this 4 stars out of 5. I think this is something that, again, I am shocked that I haven't seen it before, just from like school and from other means, because I've seen the images and some of the video of this from like being in pop culture, like in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but I'm just kind of surprised I haven't seen this in a school setting, like when I was in school. So, but this is definitely a really good documentary. So 4 stars out of 5 for me for All Mankind.
I'm a bit on the optimistic side. This will probably sit in the 85% range for me, mostly because just this feels less like a clinical documentary and more kind of like a more humanized story, especially when you have like some of the things that they capture on some of the footage. Like my favorite, as mentioned earlier, was when you had one of the astronauts just kind of goofing around, floating around in space and just kind of having a good time, and then someone from ground control ends up radioing up saying, hey, the flight director says to get the fuck back in. And it's stuff like that. You're just like, okay, so, these astronauts, while they did something just very, very extraordinary, they're also very much human as well. They're not some sort of like godly titans that are like beyond the scope of mankind or something like that. And I think it makes this documentary better as a whole for it. This is one that is definitely not going to be one that I can easily recommend to everyone, mostly because the subject matter is a bit kind of jargony. I mean, there's a lot of like space-related terms and astrophysics and stuff like that. So if you're really not into stuff like the space race or just the journey to the moon and everything like that, this documentary might not be something you might find interest in. But I think overall, just the effort that was put into this documentary is just nothing short of amazing. So I would say that if you have some interest in the journey to the moon that NASA ended up having to do just so much work and put so much labor into, definitely give this one a watch. I think it's fantastic.
I would think somebody with a passing or maybe even a slight interest in history might actually really enjoy this. I agree to a certain extent it's a little bit jargony, but it's only in, I would say, in small snippets of the movie where I would say that, where it can go over people's heads. But I think the film does a good job of just letting you see exactly what they're saying. I'm guessing, to be absolutely honest. I can only think of like a couple of scenes where it's that jargony. I think just having an interest in history, American history specifically, you would want to see this movie just to experience this type of event happening. 4 stars for me on For All Mankind, 85% for 0 on this. Great documentary, great movie. And it's a short movie. It's 80 minutes. So if you have less than an hour and a half, give it a shot. I think people might enjoy this. All right, Zero. So we are at the end of this episode, and we're going to talk about what we're watching next week. Next week's theme is going to be back to school, with school starting over again with college, high school, and the rest. I thought it would be a good idea that we start watching some movies about school. And what are we watching next week?
Animal House.
Oh, yeah. Why not? It's going to be interesting watching this movie, knowing how sentiments on certain things have changed from the time that this was made. So I have not seen this movie yet. Have you seen it?
I saw it back in the early 2000s because I think some friends of mine were like, oh, man, you got to watch this. This is like classic stuff. And I'm just like, I guess.
I have those types of things too, where just out of osmosis, people like saying, "Oh, you have to watch X because it's a classic." And I think like the one I kept hearing that I didn't do until much later was Dazed and Confused. I had so many people in high school love that movie, but because of the cover, I'm like, "Oh, it's a stoner movie. Forget it." And after I watched it, I think about 5 years ago, I was like, "Oh man, I waited too long to see this movie." It's a really good movie. All right, so tune in next week, where me and Zero are going to review National Lampoon's Animal House, directed by John Landis. I am The Wiz.
And I'm Zero.
And we'll talk to you next time. Bye.